Hi everyone, I'm Shaylin with Reedsy, and today we're going to be talking about how to write the beginning of a novel. A lot of you might be doing NaNoWriMo, which means that in the very near future you might be faced with the task of beginning your novel, which is a very daunting thing for a lot of writers. Now, novel beginnings are as diverse as novels. There's no one way to start a novel, there's no best way to start a novel, but in this video I wanted to talk about 4 different types of beginnings to give you some ideas of how you might want to structure yours and see which might be best for the book that you're writing, as well as some general good qualities to keep in mind for a strong beginning. So let's start off by talking about some different types of novel beginnings. The first one is a narrative or descriptive beginning. This is when the novel begins by an introduction to the character's internal world. We get internal narration first, so there's no actual scene. The character is introducing themselves, their life, their situation, their world. This type of beginning is super common in first-person YA novels because it introduces us to the character right away and really beckons us into the character's mind. The risk of this type of beginning is that it could lead to an info dump, where the character just tells us everything about themselves without really getting into anything plot related, or this narration could go on way too long. To avoid that, keep it as concise as possible, and in this internal narration, give us a reason to care about the character instead of just learning what their hobbies are and what they look like. The benefit of this type of beginning is that it opens with real humanity. We get an introduction to the character right away, so we probably feel quite sympathetic towards them. So in order to make good use of this type of beginning, consider what makes your character sympathetic and what makes them human, and show that, rather than worrying about getting every single possible detail we could ever know about them into this beginning. The second type of beginning would be an action beginning. This is when we begin with a played out, dramatized scene, usually something pretty interesting or engaging or high energy. It doesn't have to be the inciting incident necessarily, but it could be, or it could be something beforehand. However, it should be something interesting enough to catch the reader's attention without really knowing who the character is. With the narrative beginning, we started with character, and then we learned about situation afterwards. Here we're starting with situation, and then we're going to go back and learn about character. We're probably not going to get a lot of background information or context, but we'll learn about the character and the story through how they interact with this situation. A possible downside of this type of beginning is that it could feel floaty, like a random action sequence that we don't really have any investment in because we don't really care about the character. However, the upside is that it's very high energy, and that can make it very exciting to read and very eye-catching if it's a really intriguing situation. If you want to use this type of beginning, make sure you're using it for an appropriate situation where the situation itself can hold up as the beginning. Sometimes that opening scene can even be a bit of a cold open. Say you're writing a heist novel, you could write a little action sequence that takes place in the middle of a smaller heist to introduce us to the world in a really high energy way, and then right after that, the opportunity for the main heist that the whole book is going to follow would happen. You see this a lot in action movies, where you start with a wild chase scene and then you go back and get into the story, but the reader is really intrigued because they know there's a lot of action coming for them. The third type of beginning is a situation beginning. Now this is similar to an action beginning, but it's structured a little differently. In an action beginning, we have a scene and we work through it linearly, whereas in a situation beginning, we have a scene that we work through non-linearly. We're going to begin in the middle of a situation with something really engaging. Situation beginnings often have really eye-catching first sentences, and then after the reader has been intrigued by the situation, we're going to jump back to the beginning. So we're going to have something really high energy, intense, that's really eye-catching, and then jump back and see what led up to that moment. So it's just kind of the same thing as the action beginning, except we're going to start at the end and then work back, whereas with an action beginning, we're just going to work straight through. It's like a type of en media res. We're starting in the middle of a situation to make it as eye-catching as possible. Now, the risk of this type of beginning is that it could be confusing because of the non-linearity, or it could feel like it's trying a little too hard to hook the reader. The strength of this type of beginning is that it has the eye-catching intensity of an action beginning, but with the opportunity for added context. Let's say, for example, that we're writing a book set in a high school and it begins with the school being put on lockdown. We could start with the school being put on lockdown and have that really engaging, eye-catching start because we wonder what's going on. But instead of progressing from the lockdown forward, we're going to start with the lockdown and then go a little bit back to maybe the beginning of the day, work our way back up to see how we reach this point. The final type of beginning is the insight beginning. This is really going to pertain to your first sentence or first paragraph, and this is opening the book with a recognizable piece of wisdom or truth. A great example of this, probably the best example of this, would be Pride and Prejudice, because in its first sentence, it literally tells us that it's an insight beginning by using the phrase, "It is a truth universally acknowledged." Insight beginnings pretty much imply that, even if they're not using that exact phrasing. This type of beginning appeals to the reader by letting them know that there's going to be something thematically important and relatable and truthful about this novel. Now, if that truth and wisdom really rings accurate to the reader, it can be a really eye-catching beginning. However, if it doesn't, the character kind of loses credibility and it will feel quite forced. So if you have a really good truth and a book that really explores that and is quite theme heavy, this can be a really good option. No matter how you decide to structure your beginning, here are a few things to keep in mind that make a strong opening for a novel. First of all, you establish credibility. Just like I was talking about with the insight beginning, if the truth that the character shares doesn't ring true, it doesn't give the narrator any credibility, they actually lose it right away. Number two is that it establishes situation. If you're doing something like an insight or a narrative beginning, you run the risk of taking too long to get into the situation. Beginnings that are too internal can run the risk of floating off in the clouds and not being grounded in reality, and there's no real story there. Number three, they are distinct, specific, and insightful. This applies to both voice and situation. Right away, we want to get a feel for who the character is, and without really knowing anything about them, voice is the best tool to teach us about your character. Specific, insightful voice can do so much for establishing both credibility and relatability, as well as making the story intriguing for a reader right away. Similarly, this applies to situation. A situation that's familiar and not very specific isn't too interesting, but if we make it really distinct, something we haven't seen before, or even something we have seen before, but describing it with really specific, distinct details that set it apart from other versions of the situation, then it becomes a much stronger beginning than if it's kind of vague and there isn't a lot of specific detail. Number three, you can try to create a hook. If your situation is interesting enough, that in itself can function as a hook. Even a voice that's really interesting can be a hook, in my opinion. However, here are a few options of ways that you can really grab your reader's attention. You could introduce a mystery. If there are questions we want answered, that forms a great hook for the reader. You could hint that there's something to follow. A bit of foreshadowing or just a sense of unease that something really big is going to happen can also be a strong hook. Finally, you could use a really unusual situation or really unusual character. If your situation in itself has a lot of conflict and intrigue and is something we've never seen before, we really want to see how it's going to play out. A strong opening also provides us with a compelling character. Now, like I mentioned, voice is one of the strongest ways to do this. We can learn who the character is and get a feel for them through their voice, even if it takes a little bit of time to learn concrete details about who they are. This might be the case if you have an action beginning. Something very action heavy might not give you a lot of time to introduce what your character's life situation is because they're wrapped up in this big exciting event. However, we can learn about them through how they act, react, and relay the story. A strong beginning should also promise the content and tone that is to follow. If you have a really dark, heavy, depressing beginning, but the rest of the book is actually a lighthearted rom-com, it might not work too well because you're not promising the type of story that is to follow. If you have a book that's really quiet and subtle but begins with a massive action chase sequence, that might also be misaligned. You want your beginning to make promises to the reader so that they understand what kind of story they are picking up. And finally, a good beginning doesn't meander. Inciting incidents can happen as early as the first sentence or as late as a chapter or two in. But if you don't really have anything out of the ordinary or exciting to provide before the inciting incident, the inciting incident should be as early as possible. Readers don't have a lot of patience before the story actually begins, so get to the inciting incident as quickly as you can. There is something to say for grounding the reader in the status quo before the inciting incident, but oftentimes it doesn't take much to do that. A short scene could pull it off, or it could be something we learn about after the inciting incident occurs. So those are some tips for writing a compelling beginning. Thank you so much for watching, and remember to subscribe for new videos every Tuesday and Friday. Until next time.